2 weeks before my son's wedding, he came to my seaside house with papers that would erase my life. "Just sign here, Mom. It's for your care." I almost believed him, until I heard his fiancée whisper, "Once she's in the nursing home, sell the house." The basement matters more than the old woman. They thought I was only a lonely seamstress. They didn't know my basement held 847 vintage wedding gowns worth millions. And one of them carried the truth behind my husband's death. This story begins with love and ends with justice. Before we start, drop a comment. For me, have you ever had to protect something precious from someone you trusted? Your voice matters. Just a quick note, some details are adjusted for storytelling, but the heart of this story defending what you've built is what I hope stays with you. The voicemail played while my hands worked the delicate lace. "Mom, Sienna wants to see the house this weekend. Please tidy up, don't leave sewing supplies scattered like always." I paused mid-stitch the bone needle suspended above ivory silk that had survived 140 years, only to require my steadiest hand at dawn. Scattered. Adrian's voice carried that particular tone he'd perfected over 4 decades, apologetic as if my existence required constant explanation. At 69, I'd spent more hours in this seaside tailor shop than anywhere else on earth. The November light came through salt-streaked windows, turning the work table into a stage where history waited for resurrection. This morning's patient was an 1880s wedding dress, the lace so fragile it would disintegrate under clumsy fingers. My fingers had never been clumsy. I set down the needle and surveyed the room that my son believed was chaos. Thread spools arranged by color and weight, 47 shades from ecru to bone. Measuring tapes coiled in brass hooks, organized by metric and imperial. Pattern papers filed chronologically in wooden drawers Arthur had built me in 1994, each one labeled in my own meticulous handwriting. Every pincushion positioned for right-hand reach, every cutting blade cleaned and returned to its designated slot. 41 years I'd lived in this log cabin overlooking the Newport coastline. I knew what every floorboard sounded like underfoot, which hinges needed oil in October, where the afternoon sun would fall at 3:15 each day. I knew my own home the way a musician knows their instrument by touch, by memory, by instinct, earned through decades of attention. And I knew when something was wrong. The house had been making different sounds lately, not the settling of old wood or the expansion of joints in changing weather. These were human sounds, careful and deliberate. Someone had been inside when I was at the market. Someone had opened drawers in the study, tested locks in the basement, moved through rooms with the kind of practiced quiet that comes from not wanting to be noticed. Adrian's voicemail ended with the beep. I didn't delete it. Instead, I returned to the ivory silk guiding the needle through microscopic gaps in the weave, my hands performing the work my mind had memorized 50 years ago. The muscle memory allowed me to think. When your own child speaks to you like hired help, you notice every detail that follows. That Saturday, Adrian arrived at noon with the woman he'd been dating for 8 months. My son, 42 years old, wore the same apologetic smile he'd perfected over years of explaining away his mother's profession to colleagues who couldn't understand why he'd grown up in a house that smelled like vintage fabric and machine oil instead of success. "Mom, this is Sienna." Sienna Moreau stepped into my living room with the kind of perfect composure that comes from years of controlling every impression. 35 dark hair pulled back in a style that cost money to look effortless, wearing cream cashmere that wouldn't survive 5 minutes near my work table. She embraced me like we were old friends, her arms warm while her eyes inventoried every corner of the room. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you," Sienna said, her voice pitched exactly right, enthusiastic, but not desperate, warm, but not intrusive. "Adrian talks about you constantly." He didn't, but I smiled anyway. They stayed 2 hours. We drank tea I'd made too strong and ate shortbread I'd bought from the market because I didn't bake anymore. Adrian talked about work, about the wedding venue they'd booked in December, about logistics I only half listened to because I was cataloging something else entirely. Sienna asked her first question 20 minutes in while admiring a photograph of Arthur and me, standing outside the shop in 1985. "Does the house have a mortgage, Grandma?" It must be so peaceful owning outright. The grandma landed like she'd been using it for years. I noted that, filed it away. Paid off in 2003, I said. 40 minutes later, while Adrian was in the bathroom, Sienna ran her hand along the mantel where Arthur's woodworking awards still gathered dust. Do you have a property manager, or do you handle everything yourself? Just me. That must be exhausting at your age. The third question came as they were leaving Sienna, pausing at the doorway to look out at the coastline where gray waves met grayer sky. Has the land in this area appreciated much? Newport is so desirable now. 3 questions, 3 different angles, same target. Adrian kissed my cheek, promised to call next week, apologized again for the short notice. Sienna hugged me goodbye, her perfume expensive enough to leave a trace in the air after she'd gone. I stood at the window and watched their sedan disappear down the coast road, Adrian driving Sienna's head turned slightly, as if she were still studying the house, even in retreat. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, 69 years compressed into silver hair, and lines earned from squinting at stitches under lamplight. Behind me, the living room held the accumulated evidence of a life Arthur's handiwork in every shelf and frame, my mother's china in the cabinet, 41 years of collected moments, arranged exactly as I wanted them. Sienna had the eyes of someone who knows exactly what they want. I'd seen those eyes before. Recently. Somewhere in my files buried in the basement among records I'd kept from 4 decades of restoration work. A transaction, something that had made me pause and make a note in the margins because my instincts had caught what my conscious mind hadn't. It would take me 2 days to remember where. 2 days of sorting through client histories and payment records and photographs of dresses I'd saved from ruin. 2 days of matching a feeling to a fact. But I would remember. I always did. The light was fading over the water, turning the waves from gray to black. I touched my fingertips to the cold glass and thought about basements that held more than wedding dresses, about locks that kept secrets, as well as valuables, about the particular kind of danger that walks in wearing cashmere and calls you grandma on the first meeting. Somewhere in this house, there was an answer to what Sienna was hunting for. And somewhere in my memory, there was a reason I recognized the hunter. That evening, after their car disappeared down Ocean Avenue, I unlocked the basement door for the first time in 3 weeks. The key lived on a chain around my neck. The lock was commercial grade, installed by Arthur in 1998. The hinges made no sound. I oiled them quarterly. The stairs descended into darkness that smelled like cedar and thyme. I flipped the switch, and fluorescent panels illuminated what my family had never seen. 847 wedding dresses. They hung on cedar racks that Arthur had built to museum specifications, each gown in archival garment bags, with viewing windows at the bodice. The collection spanned 3 centuries Italian silk, from 1782 French lace, from the 1820s, American cotton from the Civil War beaded flapper sheaths, from the 20s, tea-length 50s confections. Every dress had a story. Every dress had a value. Christie's had appraised the collection at $5.8 million. Nobody knew that number except me, Helen, and the appraiser who'd spent 4 days in this basement 2 years ago. I walked down the center aisle, my footsteps quiet on rubber flooring. Each dress wore a small archival tag noting provenance condition and estimated value. Some were worth $12,000, some $60,000. The 1847 Victorian beauty in the far corner had been valued at $340,000 on its own. Arthur had brought home the first dress in 1995, an 1870s design from a Providence estate sale, bought for $40 because the silk had yellowed and the bustle had collapsed. He'd handed it to me like an apology wrapped in muslin. "Restore it," he'd said. "Then we'll see what it's really worth." I'd spent 6 weeks on that dress. When we sold it for $1,800, Arthur had looked at me with revelation in his eyes. "This is what you do," he'd said. "Not alterations, not mending, this." 26 years of building what Arthur started. 26 years of acquiring pieces other collectors had deemed too damaged, too expensive to restore. I bought them for hundreds and made them worth thousands, and I never told anyone, not Adrian, not friends, not family, who would have smiled with pity and suggested I enjoy retirement instead of working so hard. You need to understand something about people who work with their hands for 50 years. We notice when things are out of place. I stopped at the far wall before a dress that hung alone, separated from the others by 10 feet of empty space. It was covered in black cotton cloth, pinned at the shoulders and hem. I didn't lift the cloth. I never did except when absolutely necessary. Instead, I placed my palm flat against the fabric, feeling the shape underneath ivory silk 1952, with hand stitching so fine you'd need magnification to see the thread. "Arthur, I whispered, "they've arrived." The basement didn't answer, but standing there in the fluorescent quiet surrounded by 847 pieces of history that my family believed was just an old woman's hobby, I felt the weight of what Arthur had left me. Not just the dresses, not just the collection, the other thing. The thing that made this particular gown worth more than any appraiser would ever calculate. Nobody knew what that ivory dress contained. Nobody knew it could change everything. I locked the basement and climbed back upstairs to the scent of salt air and cooling tea. Monday morning arrived with fog so thick I could barely see the water. Nina Price, my assistant, let herself in through the shop entrance at 8 sharp the way she had for 3 years, since I'd hired her fresh out of the Rhode Island School of Design's Textile Conservation Program. At 27, she understood techniques most professionals had forgotten: how to stabilize antique lace, how to match thread by candlelight, how to read fabric the way archaeologists read bones. She'd never seen the basement, never understood that the careful restoration work we did upstairs was practice for the museum-quality pieces I worked on alone after hours in the locked room below. Mrs. Vale. Nina called from the front room, her voice carrying an odd tightness. "Could you come here?" I found her standing at the filing cabinet, pale enough that her freckles looked like paint spatter. She held a manila envelope in her hand. "I was looking for the Harrison invoice," she said. "And I found this in the back of the drawer. I don't think you signed these." Inside were 6 pages on letterhead from a medical practice I'd never visited. The top sheet was dated 3 weeks ago, signed with my name in handwriting that looked almost right. Same slant, same pressure, but wrong, in the way a photograph of a painting isn't quite the same as standing before the original. Diagnosis: mild cognitive impairment. Recommended treatment: transition to assisted living facility. Patient demonstrates confusion regarding financial matters, difficulty with routine tasks, and concerning lapses in memory. The second page was a brochure for Providence Care Home. The third page was a power of attorney document unsigned with my name typed in the principal field and Adrian's name typed as agent. My signature, but not my hand. Mrs. Vale. Nina's voice came from far away. "Should I call someone?" I read all 6 pages twice, my expression unchanged, while Nina stood frozen watching me like I might shatter. When I finished, I folded the papers back into the envelope, set them on the cutting table, and picked up the phone. Helen Ashford answered on the second ring. She'd been my lawyer for 12 years, had helped me set up the collections trust, knew exactly what papers I'd signed and what I hadn't. She knew what we'd been building quietly and carefully for more than a decade. "They started," I said, looking at Nina's worried face across the cutting table. "Then I'll start, too." Helen didn't ask who. She didn't need to. Her voice came back calm and ready, the sound of someone who'd been waiting for this call. "I'll make the arrangements," she said. "Don't sign anything, don't speak to anyone, and Marjorie, start documenting everything." I hung up and met Nina's eyes. "We're going to be very busy," I said. "And you're about to learn what else I do besides mend wedding dresses." Helen's voice had been steady on the phone, a sound I'd learned to trust over 12 years of careful planning. But the foundation of that trust, the reason I'd known to call her at all, began 26 years earlier with a wooden box and a husband who understood things I couldn't see yet. 26 years ago, Arthur came home just before sunset carrying a wooden box like it held something sacred. It was late October 1995, the kind of New England autumn afternoon when the light turns everything copper and gold. I was 43, standing at the kitchen sink washing thread spools when I heard his truck in the driveway. Arthur Vale, my husband of 18 years, came through the door at 48 with the kind of careful excitement he usually reserved for rare finds at estate sales. But this time, something in his eyes said this was different. He set the box on our kitchen table with the gentleness most people reserve for newborns. "Providence Auction," he said. "Small estate. Nobody else wanted it." I dried my hands and came closer. The box was cedar old enough that the joints had darkened with age. Arthur opened it slowly, and the scent that rose up was time itself, dust and silk, and something floral that had faded past recognition. Inside was a wedding dress, not a recent one, not something from the 40s or 50s that you might see in a vintage shop. This was older, the kind of old that makes you hold your breath. The fabric was ivory silk that had yellowed to cream, hand-stitched with seams, so tiny they looked like pencil lines. The sleeves were long and fitted the bodice covered in what might have once been white lace, but had oxidized to the color of weak tea, 1870s. Arthur said, running his finger along the hem without actually touching it. "Maybe earlier. The bustles collapsed, and the silk is degraded here and here." He pointed to places where the fabric had split along fold lines. "But look at this stitching. Look at the lace pattern." I looked. I'd been sewing since I was 12, doing alterations and repairs for 20 years by then, but I'd never held anything like this. The dress felt like history you could touch, like standing in a museum after hours when no one's watching. "How much did you pay?" I asked. $40. I must have made a face because he laughed the quiet laugh that meant he knew something I didn't. "It's an investment for the future," he said. "Not money, something more important." "Arthur, it's beautiful, but why spend our savings on old dresses?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat me down at the table, the dress between us like a third presence. Then he began to teach me things I hadn't known existed. How to identify authentic period fabrics by thread count and the way natural dyes aged differently than synthetic ones. How to stabilize antique textiles with archival tissue and acid-free storage. How to read provenance from construction techniques, the way bodice seams were finished, the type of thread used, the pattern of wear at stress points. How to appraise value not just from age, but from rarity, condition, and historical significance. He'd brought books too pulled from estate sales and library discard piles, conservation manuals from museums, auction house catalogs from Christie's and Sotheby's. He spread them across the table like he was building a curriculum, and he taught me with the kind of focused intensity I'd never seen in him before. "Why?" I kept asking. "Why does this matter so much?" "Because you need to know," he said. "Because someday this knowledge will protect you." That didn't make sense to me then. We were happy. Adrian was 15 and doing well in school. Arthur's carpentry business was steady. I had my sewing work. We owned our home, outright had savings, had each other. What did I need protection from? But Arthur was insistent in a way that felt almost urgent. And when someone you love teaches you something with that kind of intensity, you remember every word even 26 years later. We spent 6 weeks restoring that dress. He'd come home from work and find me at the dining table with magnification lamps and silk thread finer than human hair, stabilizing the split seams and reinforcing the bustle structure. He'd sit beside me and point out things I'd missed, a stain that needed different treatment, a way to support the fabric without stressing it further. When we finished, the dress wasn't new. It would never be new again. But it was whole, stable, beautiful in the way old things are beautiful, when they've been saved from disappearing. Arthur took photographs and sent them to 3 auction houses and 2 museum curators he'd somehow found addresses for. 2 weeks later, a collector from Boston drove down and bought it for $1,800. I stared at the check. "This is what you do," Arthur said, and his voice had that quality again, the one that said he was seeing something further ahead than I could. Not alterations, not mending. This, restoration, preservation, taking what other people think is worthless and proving they're wrong. That winter, he brought home 3 more dresses, then 5 the next spring. By the time summer came, we'd converted the basement into a proper workspace with climate control and archival storage. "Promise me something," Arthur said, one evening standing among the growing racks of carefully preserved history. It was July hot enough that we'd opened all the windows and I could smell salt air mixing with cedar. "Keep every dress I bring home. Don't sell them. Just restore them, document them, preserve them." "Arthur, we can't keep buying if we never sell. Promise me," he said, and his hand on mine was warm and certain. "Someday you'll understand why I brought them back." I didn't understand then. I didn't understand through the next 4 years of building the collection, or even after Arthur died in 1999, leaving me with 237 wedding dresses and a grief so deep I couldn't see the bottom. I didn't understand until 12 years ago, sitting in Helen Ashford's law office, when she helped me see what Arthur had been building all along. Not just a collection, not just an investment, a fortress made of silk and history. Protection I could hold in my hands when the people who were supposed to love me came looking for something to take. 12 years ago, I'd walked into Helen's office carrying Arthur's careful documentation and a question I didn't know how to ask. How do you protect something from people who don't know it exists yet? Helen Ashford's office smelled like old paper and lemon polish, the same smell that had greeted me that first afternoon when I'd asked her to make Arthur's collection untouchable. She sat behind the same massive oak desk where we'd structured everything 67 now, her silver hair pulled back in the efficient bun of someone who'd spent 3 decades protecting people's assets from those who'd steal them. The Monday afternoon light came through her window at the same angle it always had, turning dust motes into visible proof that time kept moving, whether you wanted it to or not. "Tell me what happened," Helen said, and I handed her the envelope Nina had found. She read the forged medical documents twice, her expression unchanging, then set them aside and pulled a file from her desk drawer. My name was typed on the tab in her precise capitals, Vale Textile Heritage Trust. "They can't touch it," she said, spreading papers across the oak surface between us. "Not with these documents, not with a power of attorney, not with anything short of a court order that no judge would grant based on forged medical records." The trust documents looked exactly as they had 12 years ago, dense legal language that translated to one simple fact: Arthur's collection was mine, and it would stay mine until I decided otherwise. The structure requires 3 trustee signatures to sell or transfer any asset. Helen continued her finger tracing down the page to show me what I already knew by heart. "You, me, and Russell Ward. Your son can't act unilaterally even if he somehow obtained legitimate power of attorney." "And if someone tries to force nursing home admission," I asked, "the trust automatically freezes all transactions related to your property the moment any institutional care paperwork is filed in your name. It's bulletproof, Marjorie. We built it that way." You need to understand something when you've been preparing to protect yourself for 12 years. Finding out someone is after you feels almost like vindication. Helen walked me through every protection we'd built into the structure. The independent medical evaluation requirement before any competency determination. The requirement that all 3 trustees receive certified copies of any legal documents filed regarding my capacity. The automatic notification to Helen's office if anyone tried to file probate or guardianship paperwork in my name. "They can forge your signature all they want," Helen said, "but they can't forge mine or Russell's, and they can't access the collection without us. The dresses don't legally belong to your estate. In the traditional sense, they belong to the trust, with you as primary beneficiary and decision maker. Even if Adrian somehow proved incompetence, which he can't with forged documents, he'd still need trustee approval for every transaction." I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. "So what do we do now?" I asked. "Document everything," Helen said. "Every conversation, every visit, every question about property or money, and Marjorie, find out what they're really after. People don't forge medical records over a house in Newport. There's something specific they want." I drove back to the shop knowing exactly what they wanted, but not understanding why it was worth a 3-year con to obtain it. Nina was waiting when I arrived, the shop's overhead lights making her red hair look like copper wire. "I kept searching," she said, before I'd even closed the door. "You told me to look for anyone who'd asked about specific dresses instead of general restoration work." She'd pulled 4 file boxes from storage client inquiries dating back 20 years. Most were straightforward people who'd inherited dresses and wanted them restored, or collectors looking for specific periods or styles. But one file sat alone on the cutting table, flagged with a yellow sticky note in Nina's careful handwriting, "Suspicious." The inquiry was dated August 2018, 3 years ago. The letterhead said Textile Acquisitions, LLC, with a Boston address I didn't recognize. The letter was typed "Professional offering $47,000 for one specific item, the 1952 ivory silk wedding dress with hand-stitched lace detailing at the wrists." I'd refused. I refused all purchase offers that was the promise I'd made Arthur the foundation of everything we'd built. But I'd kept the file because something about it had felt wrong. The price was too high for an inquiry made sight unseen. The specificity was too exact for a general collector. And there was a photograph attached. The woman in the photo was dressed for a business meeting. Her dark hair pulled back her smile, professional but warm. The caption on the back read, "Serena Nolan, Senior Acquisitions Specialist." Same eyes, same smile, different name. "Mrs. Vale," Nina said quietly, pulling up Adrian's engagement announcement on her phone. The photo was from 6 months ago, Adrian beaming beside his fiancée at some restaurant in Providence. "That's her. That's Sienna." I held the 2 images side by side. The hairstyle was different. The clothing was different. The context was completely different. But the face was identical, and those eyes, the predatory awareness I'd recognized during her visit, looked out from both photographs with the same calculating focus. "She offered you $47,000 for that one dress." Nina said, her voice thin with disbelief. "You refused, and then she spent 3 years getting close to Adrian." The timeline assembled itself with horrible clarity. August 2018, Serena Nolan offers a small fortune for the ivory dress. September 2018, I refuse. Sometime in late 2018 or early 2019, a woman who looks exactly like Serena Nolan, now calling herself Sienna Moreau, engineers a meeting with my son. 8 months ago, engagement. 6 weeks from now, wedding. 3 years of planning. 3 years of performance. 3 years of building trust and access, all to obtain something I'd refused to sell. I stared at the photograph of Serena Nolan from 2018, then at my son's engagement photo. My son hadn't chosen her. She'd chosen him 3 years after I refused to sell her the dress. That meant she didn't just want my house, or my money, or my property. She wanted what was inside that ivory dress, and she'd spent 3 years planning how to get it, which meant someone else knew what it contained. Someone had told her it was worth $47,000 sight unseen, worth forging medical records, worth marrying into a family for access. And I needed to find out who that someone was before the wedding gave her everything she'd been working toward. Someone else knew what was inside that dress. Someone had told Sienna it was worth 3 years of her life to obtain. The knock came at 7 in the morning before I'd even unlocked the shop door, 3 sharp raps that sounded like fear. Victor Lane stood on my doorstep wearing the same felt hat he'd worn to Arthur's funeral 22 years ago. 70 years old now, Arthur's old friend from the textile dealer circuit, someone I hadn't seen in a decade. His face had the color of old newspaper, and his hands shook when he gripped the brim of his hat. "Marjorie," he said, and my name came out like an apology. "I shouldn't be here." "Then why are you—" He looked over his shoulder at the empty street, at nothing and everything. "You should sell this house. Go somewhere else. Newport isn't safe for you anymore." I stepped back and gestured him inside, but he shook his head and stayed on the threshold. "Victor, what are you talking about?" "Just sell it," he said, and his voice cracked. "Sell the house, sell everything and go before it's too late." "Too late for what?" He opened his mouth, closed, it looked over his shoulder again. I'd known this man for 30 years. He'd come to dinner at our house. He'd helped Arthur source some of the earliest pieces in the collection. After Arthur died, he'd sent flowers and stood in the back row at the funeral, and then I'd never heard from him again. Now he was standing on my doorstep, shaking. "Who are you afraid of?" I asked. Victor's face went from newspaper gray to chalk white. He took 2 steps backward, nearly stumbling off the porch step. "I can't," he said. "I shouldn't have come." "Victor." But he was already turning away, walking fast toward a sedan parked 3 shops down, moving like someone who just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. When a man you've known for 30 years shows up terrified and won't tell you why, you know exactly one thing: someone got to him first. I stood there on my doorstep for 5 minutes after his car disappeared, trying to assemble pieces that didn't want to fit together. Sienna had spent 3 years planning to obtain one dress. Victor had spent 10 years too afraid to visit an old friend. Arthur had died in 1999 in an accident that had never quite felt accidental. Somewhere in Newport, there was a thread connecting all of it. That afternoon, I drove to the harbor. Newport Harbor in November smelled like salt and diesel and cold water. I found the office I was looking for at the end of Sea Pier, a small weathered building with a hand-painted sign that said Ward Maritime Services. Russell Ward sat behind a desk surrounded by nautical charts and maintenance schedules. 61 years old, lean in the way men get when they've spent their lives doing physical work, with the kind of watchful eyes that belong to someone who'd spent years reading people and situations. He looked up when I entered, and I saw recognition flicker across his face before he managed to smooth it into professional neutrality. "Mrs. Vale," he said. "What can I do for you?" "My son is getting married in 6 weeks," I said. "The ceremony is on a yacht. I'd like to hire you as captain." His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of his attention. "There are a dozen captains in Newport who handle wedding charters." "I'm aware. Most of them charge less than I do." "I'll pay double your standard rate," I said. Now his eyebrows rose. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of focus that confirmed what I'd suspected from the moment I'd found his name in Arthur's files. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you're the only captain in Newport I trust." "You don't know me." "I know enough." Case number 99-1847. Arthur's accident. Russell's last investigation. I'd found the file in Arthur's papers 2 years after he died. Just a thin folder with a case number containing 3 pages of incident report and handwritten notes in margins. The officer's signature at the bottom had been Detective Russell Ward, Newport PD. The notes had raised questions the official report hadn't answered. Brake line degradation inconsistent with maintenance records. Witness testimony retracted within 24 hours. Missing wooden box reported at scene but never logged into evidence. The file had been marked closed. Accidental death. But someone had written one word in the margin of the final page, underlined twice incomplete. 6 months after Arthur's death, Russell Ward had transferred from Newport PD to the Coast Guard, then retired early to run yacht services from a small office on Sea Pier. He watched me now with careful attention, trying to determine what game was being played. "The wedding is December 11th, I said. "Reception on the yacht after the ceremony. Approximately 350 guests. I'll need you available for the full day." "I'll need to check my schedule." "Of course." I stood to leave, then paused and reached into my purse. The piece of paper I placed on his desk contained 7 numbers and nothing else. No explanation, no signature, no context. Just a case file number from 1999. "In case you need to remember what case that was," I said. Russell looked at the paper. His face went very still, the kind of still that comes from training and discipline, from years of not showing reaction even when reaction wants to break through. I walked back to my car knowing he'd remember. He'd been the only police officer who questioned whether Arthur's death was really an accident. He'd started asking the right questions, documenting anomalies, building towards something that someone had made sure he never finished. And now, 22 years later, I just asked him to captain a wedding where every guest would be a witness to whatever truth we uncovered. He'd either call me tomorrow to accept the job, or he'd call to tell me to stay away from old cases that had been closed for good reason. Either way, I'd know whether I had an ally or just another person who'd learned to stop asking questions. I'd given Russell Ward a choice: finish what someone silenced 22 years ago, or walk away from questions that should have been answered in 1999. Russell called at 6:30 the next morning before I'd even started the coffee. I kept the file. He said no greeting, no preamble. 22 years. They ordered me to close it, mark it accidental, move on. I kept it anyway. I pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down the phone, pressed to my ear, watching dawn light turn the ocean from black to gray through my window. Tell me, I said. 3 things never added up, Russell said, and I could hear paper rustling in the background like he was reading from notes he'd memorized decades ago. First, the brakes. Your husband's truck went off Ocean Road at the curve near Brenton Point. Single vehicle accident, no witnesses at the scene. But when I examined the brake line, the degradation was wrong. Too clean, too uniform. Someone had tampered with it professionally, not a natural failure. My hand tightened on the phone. I'd known. For 22 years, I'd known in the way you know something without proof, the way your body understands truth before your mind can assemble evidence. Second, Russell continued, there was a wooden box. Multiple witnesses at the Providence auction said Arthur was carrying a wooden box when he left. About yay big. He paused and I could picture him gesturing dimensions with his hands, even though I couldn't see him. 8 by 12 inches, looked old, had a brass clasp. Never found at the accident scene. Never logged into evidence. Just gone. And the third, I asked, though my throat felt tight. Mrs. Eleanor Kemp. She lived on Ocean Road, was walking her dog that afternoon. She told me she saw another car following your husband from the auction. Dark sedan stayed 2 car lengths back the whole way. She was certain about it, gave me a detailed statement. Then 48 hours later, she called and said she'd been mistaken. There was no other car, she'd confused it with another day. Someone got to her. Someone got to her, Russell confirmed. And when I tried to follow up, my lieutenant pulled me into his office and explained that Mrs. Vale was grieving and didn't need me creating conspiracy theories about her husband's accident. 2 weeks later, I was transferred to Marine Patrol. 6 months after that, I took early retirement. For 22 years, I'd lived with the word accident like a stone in my throat, unable to swallow it, unable to spit it out. The brake line tampering alone should have triggered a criminal investigation, Russell said, and his voice carried the weight of 2 decades of knowing he'd been right and being silenced anyway. But someone wanted it closed fast, someone with enough influence to make sure it stayed closed. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the water where Arthur used to take his morning walks before work. The ocean was the same as it had been the day he died, indifferent to human grief, indifferent to human evil. What was in the box? Russell asked. I don't know, I said, which was technically true. I knew where it was. I knew what Arthur had told me to do with it. But I'd never opened it, never looked at what was inside because Arthur had made me promise to keep it sealed until the right time. And looking at what's inside evidence before you're ready to use it means you can't later claim you didn't know what you had. But you know where it went, Russell said, reading the pause in my answer. Yes. How long have you known? Since the night before he died. The line went quiet except for the sound of Russell's breathing. You have to understand when you know in your bones that someone murdered your husband and got away with it. Every day is a choice between rage and patience. Every day you choose whether to scream the truth to anyone who will listen or to wait until you have enough pieces to make the truth impossible to ignore. I'd chosen patience. I'd chosen to wait. And now, 22 years later, the person who'd been looking for Arthur's evidence had finally revealed themselves by walking into my house, wearing cashmere and calling me Grandma. Arthur came home from the Providence auction on November 3rd, 1999. I said my voice steady, even though my hand shook slightly where it gripped the windowsill. He had the wooden box with him. That night, he stayed up until 3 a.m. working in the basement. I asked what he was doing. He said he was preparing for something, and if anything happened to him, I should keep the ivory dress forever and never let anyone take it. The ivory dress, Russell repeated. 1952 hand-stitched silk with lace detailing at the wrists. He spent all night reinforcing the lining, sewing something into it. The next day, he left for work and never came home. So the box wasn't found at the scene because it wasn't in the truck. Whatever Arthur brought back from Providence Whatever someone was willing to kill him for, he'd already hidden it, in the lining of a wedding dress that's been hanging in my basement for 22 years. The silence stretched between us filled with implications and questions, and the weight of evidence that had been waiting in the dark for more than 2 decades. If you've had evidence for 22 years. Russell finally said, his voice quiet, now careful. Why wait until now? I looked out at the ocean, at the November sky turning from gray to pale blue, at the world that had kept turning even after Arthur stopped being in it. Because now I know who's looking for it, I said. The woman who's marrying my son spent 3 years planning how to get access to my house. She approached me in 2018 under a different name, offered me $47,000 for that specific dress. When I refused, she found my son and made him fall in love with her. She's been looking for Arthur's evidence for years, which means someone told her what it was and where it was hidden. Someone who knew Arthur, Russell said. Someone who knew Arthur knew about the box and has been searching for it ever since. Someone with enough power to cover up a murder in 1999 and enough resources to send a professional con artist after it 22 years later. And you're planning to let her walk right into it. At a wedding, I said, with 350 witnesses and you as captain. Yes, that's exactly what I'm planning to do. After I hung up with Russell, I stood at my kitchen window looking at the sea and thinking about promises kept in the dark. 22 years of waiting. 22 years of knowing Arthur had left me something I shouldn't open until the right moment arrived. 22 years ago, I woke at 3 a.m. to find Arthur sitting at my sewing table with the ivory dress spread across his lap needle and thread, moving in the lamplight. November 1999. I was 47, still young enough that waking in the middle of the night felt like interruption rather than routine. Our bedroom was cold. We kept the heat low to save money back then, and the lamplight from my work table threw Arthur's shadow long across the wooden floor. He sat bent over the dress, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his carpenter's hands moving with surprising delicacy through ivory silk that had survived half a century before we'd acquired it. The needle caught the light each time he pulled thread through fabric, a tiny flash of silver in the November darkness. "Arthur," I said, pulling my robe around my shoulders. "It's 3 a.m. What are you doing with that dress?" He looked up and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Not quite fear, not quite resignation. Something in between, like a man who'd made a decision he wished he didn't have to make. "Come here," he said quietly. I crossed the cold floor in bare feet and stood behind him, my hand on his shoulder. The dress was the 1952 ivory silk piece he'd brought home from Providence 6 months earlier, one of the more valuable additions to our growing collection. He'd opened the lining at the waist seam, creating a pocket between the silk exterior and the cotton backing. Something small rested inside the opening, a cylinder about the size of my thumb, metallic, sealed. "What is that?" I asked. "Insurance," Arthur said, and his hands kept moving, needle pulling new stitches to close the lining around whatever he'd hidden. "Or evidence. Depends on what happens next." "Evidence of what?" He didn't answer right away. His stitches were tiny, precise, invisible once the seam closed. I'd taught him basic mending years ago, but this was different. This was the work of someone who needed something to stay hidden. "Keep this dress, Marjorie," he finally said, not looking up from his work. "Don't sell it. Don't give it away. Keep it exactly as it is. If anything happens to me, look in the lining." Something cold moved through my chest. "What could happen, Arthur? You're scaring me." "I'm being careful," he said, finishing the last stitch and cutting the thread with my small scissors. He held the dress up to the light, examining his work. The seam was perfect, invisible, identical to the original stitching from 1952. "That's all. Just promise me." "Promise what?" "That you'll keep this dress, that you won't let anyone take it, and if something happens—" He set the dress down and took both my hands in his, looking up at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "If something happens to me, you look in this lining and you'll know what to do. When you watch someone you love prepare for their own death without knowing that's what you're watching, every detail becomes sacred afterward." I promised. What else could I do? The man I'd loved for 19 years was sitting at my sewing table at 3 in the morning, sewing secrets into wedding dresses and asking me to trust him. So I promised. "Good," he said, and kissed my forehead. "Go back to sleep. I'll put this away and be right there." But I didn't go back to sleep. I stood in the doorway and watched him carry the dress downstairs to the basement, watched him hang it on the rack at the far wall, watched him stand there for a long moment with his hand on the silk like he was saying goodbye. When he came back to bed, I asked him what he'd found at the Providence auction that afternoon. He said nothing important, just documentation of some questionable valuations. He said he'd handle it. He said everything would be fine. I need you to understand Arthur didn't just hide evidence that night. He hid his fear so I could sleep. The next morning, November 4th, he got up at his usual time, made coffee, ate toast standing at the counter while reading the newspaper, kissed me goodbye like he always did, his hand lingering on my cheek for just a moment longer than usual. "I love you," he said. "I love you too. Drive safe." "Always do." He left for Providence at dawn, heading to a meeting he'd mentioned the night before. Something about following up on auction records, verifying some dates with a colleague. Nothing that sounded dangerous, nothing that sounded like the last morning of a man's life. The police called at 4:30 that afternoon. Single-car accident. Ocean Road near Brenton Point. Brake failure. The truck went off the curve and hit the rocks. He died on impact, they said. He didn't suffer, they said. These things happen, they said. I kept my promise. For 22 years, I kept that dress exactly where Arthur had left it, hanging on the basement rack with a black cloth covering it to protect the silk from light. I never looked in the lining, never opened the seam he'd sewn with such care, never checked to see what small cylinder he'd hidden in the fabric, because Arthur had said, "If something happens to me, look in the lining." And I understood what that meant. Not if I was curious, not if I was ready. If something happened that required the evidence he'd left behind. For 22 years, nothing required it. And then Serena Nolan walked into my shop offering $47,000 for one specific dress. That's when I knew. Someone was looking for what Arthur had hidden. Someone who'd been searching for 22 years, who'd silenced witnesses and covered up murder and waited patiently for the evidence to surface. That's when I knew the right moment had finally arrived, and Arthur's last gift to me wasn't just evidence. It was time. The right moment arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when Nina called from her car, and I learned that my son had been protecting his father's killers all along. Nina called me at 2 in the afternoon, her voice tight with something between confusion and alarm. "Mrs. Vale, there's a man leaving Victor Lane's house, and Victor looks terrified." I set down the thread I'd been winding and pressed the phone closer to my ear. "Where are you?" "Maple Street." I was running errands, picking up supplies from the fabric shop on 4th, and I saw Victor's address on a package. "I remembered him from your stories, thought I'd drop by and say hello from you, but there's a man here. Expensive suit just came out of Victor's front door. Victor's standing in the doorway and his hands are shaking." "What does the man look like?" "50s maybe. Gray at the temples. Black Mercedes, corporate type. He's getting in his car now. Should I Mrs. Vale Victor just went back inside and closed the door?" He looked scared. Something cold settled in my stomach. "Can you get a photo of the man of the license plate?" "Already did," Nina said, and I heard the click of her phone camera through the line. "Sending them now." My phone buzzed with the incoming images while Nina stayed on the line. The first photo showed a man in a charcoal suit standing beside a black Mercedes S-Class briefcase, in hand the kind of vehicle that cost more than most people earned in a year. The second photo was a clear shot of the license plate. The third was Victor in his doorway, his face pale enough to show, even in the afternoon shadows, one hand gripping the door frame like he needed it to stay upright. I enlarged the first photo, zooming in on the man's face. My blood went cold. "Mrs. Vale." Nina's voice came through distant and worried. "Do you know who that is?" "Yes," I said, and my voice sounded strange in my own ears, flat and careful. "That's Marcus Brennan, my son's corporate lawyer." The silence on the line stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Your son sent his lawyer to Victor's house." Nina finally said slowly, like she was working through the implications as she spoke. Victor, who was Arthur's friend. Victor, who came to warn you last week and couldn't tell you why. Adrian's lawyer at Victor's house today. Marcus Brennan was Adrian's corporate lawyer, the kind of man who specialized in making problems disappear through precisely worded letters and the implicit threat of expensive litigation. I'd met him twice once at a company dinner 3 years ago once when Adrian had asked me to review some estate planning documents last year. Both times Marcus had been professionally pleasant, the kind of lawyer who made you feel like everything was handled. Everything was under control. Nothing would go wrong as long as you did exactly what he advised. And now he was leaving Victor Lane's house, with Victor looking like a man who'd just been given a very clear message about what happens to people who talk. I need to go, I told Nina. What are you going to do? Something I should have done 22 years ago, I said, and ended the call. I stood at my cutting table, holding my phone, staring at the 3 photographs Nina had sent. Marcus Brennan's professional smile, the Mercedes license plate, Victor's terrified face. The timeline assembled itself with brutal precision. Victor appears at my door last week, terrified, telling me to leave Newport. He won't say why. He won't say who he's afraid of. He runs away when I ask. Today, Adrian's lawyer visits Victor's house, which means Adrian knows. Maybe not everything. Maybe not who exactly pulled the brake line or followed Arthur from Providence, but he knows enough to send his lawyer to silence witnesses. He knows enough to be part of the cover-up. There's betrayal, and then there's this, your own child protecting the people who murdered his father because they're promising him money. I thought about Adrian at 15 crying at his father's funeral, asking me over and over if the accident could have been prevented. I thought about Adrian at 20, helping me sort through Arthur's tools in the workshop, unable to throw anything away because it all still smelled like sawdust in his father's hands. I thought about Adrian calling me last month with that voicemail tidy up. Don't leave sewing supplies scattered like always. My son who'd loved his father. My son who'd grieved him. My son who now, 22 years later, was making sure I never learned the truth about how Arthur died. Because someone had made him a deal. Someone had told him about the house, the property, the collection I'd never told him about. Someone had shown him what he could have if he just played along. Helped them get what they wanted, kept his mother's questions unanswered. And my son who I'd raised, who I'd taught to read, who I'd held through nightmares and heartbreak and the terrible grief of losing his father, had said yes. The forged medical records weren't just about stealing my house. They were about making sure I could never ask questions, never investigate, never look too closely at an accident from 1999 that someone with power and money wanted to stay buried. Sienna was the weapon, but Adrian had aimed it. I sat down at my cutting table because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the wood, feeling the grain Arthur had sanded smooth 20 years ago when he'd built this table for my 49th birthday. Arthur, orc, I whispered to the empty shop, to the ghost of promises made in darkness. Our son knows. He knows what they did to you, and he's helping them do it to me. The pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. Adrian knew. Maybe not who exactly, maybe not all the details. But he knew his father's death wasn't an accident, and whoever killed Arthur had bought my son's silence with promises of property and money and a future built on his mother's institutional disappearance. Victor had been carrying this secret alone for 22 years, terrified and silent. It was time to set him free. My son had sold out his father's memory for money. Someone needed to remember what loyalty looked like. I was in my car heading to Victor's house. Within 10 minutes, the photograph of Marcus Brennan's Mercedes still glowing on my phone screen. Victor lived in a small craftsman on Maple Street, the kind of house that had been built in the 20s when Newport still had working-class neighborhoods. I'd been here once years ago for a dinner party Arthur had insisted we attend. The porch still had the same rocking chair, the same hanging basket that now held dead flowers from a summer no one had bothered to replant. I knocked 3 times. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Victor, I called through the door. It's Marjorie Vale. I know what happened this afternoon. Please open the door. Silence. Then footsteps slow and hesitant. The door opened 6 inches, held by a chain lock, and Victor's face appeared in the gap. His eyes were red, his face older than it had been a week ago when he'd shown up at my shop, unable to explain his fear. "Marjorie," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should Marcus Brennan," I said, and held up my phone with the photograph of the black Mercedes. "This is my son's lawyer's car. I know what he came here to tell you. You're not alone anymore." The chain lock rattled as Victor's hands shook trying to unlatch it. When the door finally opened, he stood there in his cardigan and house slippers looking at me like I was a life raft appearing in dark water. 22 years, he said. And then he was crying, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and long buried, the kind that shakes a person's whole frame. 22 years, I've been afraid to say his name. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. Victor's living room smelled like old coffee and loneliness, the curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, photographs on the mantel showing a younger version of the man, now weeping in his entryway. When you watch a 70-year-old man cry for the first time in 2 decades, you understand exactly how long injustice can live inside a person. I let him cry. I stood there with my hand on his shoulder while 22 years of terror and silence broke open until finally he straightened and wiped his face with a handkerchief that had been Arthur's. I recognized the embroidered initials in the corner. They told me if I ever spoke about what I saw, they'd make sure I lost everything. Victor said, his voice raw. My house, my business, my reputation. They said Arthur had been careless and caused his own accident, and if I suggested otherwise, they'd make sure everyone knew I was a liar and a troublemaker. What did you see? The box, Victor said. The wooden box Arthur bought at the Providence auction the day before he died. I was there. I saw what was inside before he closed it. Documentation. Photographs. Proof that someone at Blackwell Auction House had been fraudulently inflating valuations for years, selling fake provenance to wealthy collectors for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Arthur said he was going to report it. I told him to be careful. The next day he was dead. He walked to a desk in the corner and pulled open a drawer with trembling hands. Inside was a manila envelope sealed with Arthur's handwriting across the front for Marjorie. When the time is right. Arthur gave me this 3 days before he died, Victor said, holding the envelope like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He said if anything happened to him, I should wait until you were ready, until you had allies, until the people who killed him showed themselves. He said, Victor, she'll know when. Trust her. I took the envelope with hands that were steadier than I felt. Arthur's handwriting, Arthur's words, Arthur's voice reaching across 22 years to tell me he'd known exactly what was coming and had prepared me for it anyway. The lawyer this afternoon. Victor said, he told me to forget everything. He said my memory of the auction was unreliable, that I was old and confused, that making accusations now would only hurt people I cared about. He meant you. He meant if I talked, they'd make sure you suffered for it. They're going to make me suffer anyway, I said, but not the way they think. That weekend, Russell Ward came to my shop after closing hours, carrying what remained of his investigation file in a leather portfolio that looked older than his retirement. We sat across from each other at my cutting table, the November evening dark outside the windows, the shop quiet except for the sound of pages turning and truths finally being spoken aloud. My wife Catherine wore one of your dresses at our wedding, Russell said apropos of nothing while we were reviewing witness statements from 1999. 1920s ivory silk. You restored it for her mother. She said you made her feel like she was carrying history. I looked up from the file. I remember Catherine. I remember that dress. She died in 2003. Cancer. Russell's voice was quiet, matter-of-fact, the tone of someone who'd made peace with grief years ago. I kept the dress. It's in my closet still. Can't seem to let it go. Some alliances are built on strategy. Ours was built on the specific grief of loving someone whose death was never properly mourned. The wedding yacht. Russell said, pulling us back to the present. That's where we do this. 4 weeks from now, on the water nowhere for anyone to run. You'll have your evidence. I'll have my investigation file, and 350 witnesses will hear exactly what happened to Arthur Vale in 1999. And my son will have to choose, Russell said, whether he's his father's son or his fiance's accomplice. I thought about Adrian at 15 crying at Arthur's funeral. I thought about Adrian at 42 sending his lawyer to silence terrified old men. I don't think he knows how to make that choice anymore, I said. Then we'll make it for him, Russell said. He stood to leave, then turned back at the door. 4 weeks, 1 yacht in Newport Bay. Your son thinks he's trapping you. He has no idea we're trapping him. I looked at Arthur's letter Victor had given me, still sealed after 22 years, heavy with words my husband had written, knowing he'd never see me read them. Noah, I said quietly, he has no idea at all. Adrian had no idea we were setting a trap. But while we planned the people closest to him were beginning to see through the lies. Jonah showed up on a Tuesday afternoon with his backpack and that particular energy that meant he'd fought with his father again. My grandson, 28 years old, stood in my kitchen doorway looking like most people do after fighting with family defiant on the surface, hurt underneath and not quite ready to talk about it. He had his father's height, but his grandfather's hands, carpenter's hands, that gripped his backpack strap like an anchor. Grandma, he said, can I hide here for a while? Always, I said, and put the kettle on. We sat at the kitchen table while afternoon light came through salt-streaked windows. Jonah didn't talk about the fight right away. He never did. Instead, he asked about my work, about the dress I was restoring, about whether I'd heard from Victor Lane lately. That last question made me pause. Why do you ask about Victor? Jonah shrugged, stirring sugar into his tea. Dad mentioned him the other day, said something about old family friends being unreliable. Then Sienna was on the phone this morning and I heard her say something weird. Blackwell Auction House. She said it like it was important, like she was angry about it. My blood ran cold, but I kept my expression neutral, kept stirring my tea, like my grandson hadn't just handed me the final piece of the puzzle. Blackwell Auction House, the name from Arthur's investigation, the fraud case that had gotten my husband killed. Did she say anything else? I asked carefully. Something about records and they never found it. Then she saw me and stopped talking. Jonah looked up from his tea. Grandma, why would she care about an auction house? I don't know, I lied, but thank you for telling me. When Jonah left 2 hours later, I watched him walk to his car and thought about inheritance in ways that had nothing to do with money. Arthur's hands, Arthur's perception, Arthur's instinct for when something wasn't right. My grandson had inherited all of it. That night, lying in bed unable to sleep, I got a text message at 1 a.m. Grandma, found something about Sienna. Can we talk tomorrow? I stared at the message in the dark and felt something like hope mixed with fear. When a 28-year-old stumbles onto the same truth you've been protecting for decades, you realize the younger generation might be smarter than anyone gave them credit for. Yes, I texted back, tomorrow, be careful. 2 days later, I returned from the fabric supply store earlier than planned and found Sienna standing at my basement door. She had her back to me, her hand on the doorknob, and I could see 3 different keys laid out on the small table beside the door. Keys that didn't belong to my house, keys she was systematically trying in a lock she had no business touching. I stood at the top of the stairs watching her for 3 seconds. 3 seconds to observe how methodical she was, how focused, how completely absorbed in breaking into my basement. Different keys. She had a collection. She'd been planning this. Sienna. I said, my voice pleasant and warm, and watched her spine go rigid before she turned. Her recovery was instant and flawless. The keys disappeared into her pocket in one smooth motion, and her face rearranged itself into surprised delight so quickly I might have missed the fear if I hadn't been looking for it. Mom, she said, and the words still felt like theft. I was looking for the holiday decorations. Adrian said you kept them in the basement, but this door seems to be locked. I came down the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, giving her time to commit fully to the lie. That lock's been broken for years. I said, stopping 2 steps above her so I had the height advantage. Can't open it even with the right key. The storage is actually upstairs, dear. Let me show you. I led her away from the basement up the stairs to a legitimate storage closet that did contain holiday decorations I hadn't touched in 5 years. Dusty boxes of ornaments and garland, exactly what a helpful future daughter-in-law might want for a wedding. Sienna made appropriate noises, pulled out a few items, asked if she could borrow some for the reception. Her performance was perfect. Her smile never wavered. But I'd seen her at that basement door. I'd seen the keys. I'd seen the methodical determination of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and wouldn't stop until they found it. After she left, I went back to the basement door and examined the lock. She'd tried 4 keys. I could see fresh scratches in the brass, where metal had scraped against metal marks that hadn't been there this morning. 4 keys that hadn't worked. But she'd keep trying. She'd find more keys, pick the lock, bribe a locksmith, break a window. She'd find a way in because she was running out of time and options and patience. 3 weeks until the wedding. 3 weeks until Adrian thought he'd won, until Sienna thought she'd finally obtain what she'd spent years planning to steal, until my son stood on a yacht announcing to 350 guests that his mother needed institutional care. 3 weeks until Russell Victor and I showed them what evidence really meant. That night, lying awake, I understood the chessboard clearly Jonah was investigating to protect me. Sienna was searching to destroy me. Both were closing in on the same truth about that ivory dress in my basement, the dress containing microfilm evidence of fraud and murder, the dress that had been waiting 22 years for exactly this moment. What neither of them knew was that I was about to move first. Arthur's sealed letter sat in my nightstand drawer. Russell's investigation file lay in my safe. Victor's testimony waited to be spoken. And in my basement behind a lock, Sienna couldn't yet break 847 wedding dresses held the history that would bury her. 3 weeks, that's all the time she had left to search. I'd been preparing for 22 years. I said I was about to move first, but sometimes the first move is letting your opponent reveal themselves completely before you strike. Adrian showed up alone on a Thursday evening 2 weeks before his wedding, and for the first time in years, he looked like my son instead of a stranger. No Sienna at his side, no practiced smile, no apologetic explanation for why his mother needed to tidy up. Just my 42-year-old son standing on my porch in the November cold, his tie loosened his eyes, tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "Mom," he said, "can I come in?" I stepped aside and let him pass. We sat in the living room where he'd grown up, where Arthur had taught him chess at that same coffee table, where family photographs still lined the mantel showing a version of Adrian who'd loved his father and trusted his mother. He didn't speak right away. Just sat with his hands clasped between his knees, staring at the floor like it held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. "The hotel failed." He finally said, his voice quiet and defeated. "The boutique hotel in Providence. It was supposed to be my retirement plan, my legacy project. We opened 6 months before the pandemic hit. By the time lockdown ended, I was $680,000 in debt. I'd known about the hotel. Adrian had mentioned it years ago, excited about the investment, the opportunity. I hadn't known it had collapsed. I hadn't known he'd been drowning in debt for 2 years while smiling through family dinners and engagement announcements. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because you would have tried to help," Adrian said, and looked up at me with Arthur's eyes in a face aged by stress I hadn't seen because I'd been too busy watching for different threats. "And I couldn't take money from you. Not after everything Dad left you worked so hard to build." Something twisted in my chest. He thought I'd built my restoration business through hard work. He had no idea about the basement, the collection, the inheritance that could have saved him if he'd just asked instead of letting Sienna offer solutions. "Sienna says if we sell this house, we can start over." Adrian continued his words, coming faster now, like he'd been holding them in too long. "Pay everything off. The house is worth at least $2 million, maybe more with the oceanfront location. Split between us, I could be solvent again. You could move somewhere easier to maintain smaller. She's just trying to help. She's been so supportive through all of this." There's a particular kind of heartbreak in watching your child realize they've been played and knowing you can't save them, only let them save themselves. When did she first suggest selling my house, Adrian? He blinked, thrown by the question. I don't know. A few months ago, 6 months. She said you were getting older, that maintaining this place must be hard, that it would be easier for everyone if… 6 months ago, I repeated. Before or after you told her about the debt. Adrian's face went through several expressions as he worked backward through memory, trying to place the timeline, trying to remember who'd suggested what first. I watched him arrive at the answer and not want to believe it. I think, before, he said slowly, but that doesn't, she was just being practical. She works in event planning, she knows real estate values. She works in event planning. I agreed. What did you say her previous job was before she moved to Newport? Adrian opened his mouth, then closed it. I don't actually know. She said she moved here for a fresh start. Something about a bad breakup. I nodded and let the silence do its work. Let my son sit with the realization that he was marrying someone whose entire professional history was a blank space filled with convenient stories. I should go, he said, standing abruptly. I just wanted you to understand. About the house. About why I… He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say why he'd agreed to have his mother declared incompetent for money. Couldn't admit that desperation had made him complicit in something that would have destroyed me. I walked him to the door and watched him drive away, and I didn't tell him what I knew. Didn't tell him about Serena Nolan, about Blackwell Auction House, about the 3-year con his fiancée had orchestrated. He needed to see it himself. He needed to be there when the evidence came out. 10 days before the wedding, I had my scheduled appointment with Dr. Elise Harlow. Dr. Harlow, 45 and normally composed, greeted me in her examination room with hands that trembled slightly and the tight smile of someone who'd agreed to do something she knew was wrong. The checkup was cursory. Blood pressure, heart rate. 5 minutes of going through motions while her eyes kept darting to a folder on her desk. Everything looks fine, she said, her voice too bright. Just need you to sign some updated insurance forms for your records. She slid the folder across the desk. I opened it and read every page carefully while she watched her composure cracking with each passing second. Page 3 contained the assessment, mild cognitive impairment, difficulty with routine tasks, confusion regarding financial matters, recommended placement, assisted living facility, immediate transition, advised. When someone tries to have you declared incompetent, you have 2 choices, rage or documentation. I chose documentation. I looked up from the papers and met Dr. Harlow's eyes. I didn't know cognitive assessments were insurance forms. Her face went pale. Mrs. Vale. I know you owe money, Dr. Harlow, I said quietly. Student loans, probably. Maybe a mortgage underwater from the 2008 crash. And I know who asked you to sign this. Her hands were shaking openly now. I didn't want to… But you did anyway, I said. I stood leaving the unsigned papers on her desk. I remember exactly what happened here today. Every detail, every word. I'll remember it in 10 days when other things come to light. Dr. Harlow sat frozen behind her desk holding the unsigned assessment papers, understanding that I'd caught her, but hadn't destroyed her yet. I walked out knowing she'd spend the next 10 days wondering when the other shoe would drop. Let her wonder. Let Marcus Brennan wonder. Let Adrian and Sienna count down to a wedding that they thought would be their victory. I was building a file that would drop every shoe at once. Every piece of evidence I collected was another nail in a coffin I was building with precision. Dr. Harlow's unsigned forms, Marcus Brennan's license plate, the forged medical records. But I needed the financial proof, the contract that would show exactly how they planned to steal everything. Nina walked into Graham Locke's brokerage office at 10:30 on a Wednesday morning, while I sat in my Buick across the street, phone in hand, watching her disappear through the glass doors. We'd rehearsed the cover story 3 times. Nina was a young professional newly relocated to Newport looking for a rental property near the water, something with character, willing to pay above market rate for the right place, the kind of client real estate agents salivate over, the kind that gets invited into private offices with minimal questions asked. I watched through the plate glass window as Graham Locke rose from his desk to greet her. 50 years old, wearing the kind of expensive suit that suggested he made his real money on side deals rather than honest commissions. He had the practiced smile of someone who'd learned to size up a client's bank account in the first 30 seconds, and from the way he gestured Nina toward his desk, he'd sized her up as worth his time. My phone was in my lap, volume up, waiting. They sat, they talked. Nina played her part perfectly. I could see her leaning forward with interest, asking questions, nodding at his responses. Graham gestured expansively the way salesmen do when they're building rapport, establishing trust. Then he stood and walked toward the back of the office, disappearing through a door that probably led to filing rooms or storage. Nina had maybe 2 minutes. My phone buzzed. Nina on desk, photographing now. I watched her lean over Graham's desk, her phone out, taking pictures of something I couldn't see from across the street. 1 photo, 2, 3. Her movements were quick and efficient, and then she was sitting back in her chair. Phone away expression casual, just as Graham reappeared carrying a folder. When you send your 27-year-old assistant into a lion's den with nothing but a cover story and a camera phone, you learn what trust really means. Nina stayed another 10 minutes looking through the rental listings Graham provided, asking appropriate questions, promising to think about the options and call back soon. When she finally emerged from the office, she walked directly to her own car 2 spaces down from mine without making eye contact. My phone buzzed with incoming photos. 3 images. I enlarged the first one. Sale contract, residential property address, my address, seller Marjorie L. Vale buyer, Blackwell Properties, LLC sale price $210,000. My hands tightened on the phone. The second image showed the terms section, standard language about inspections and contingencies, all waived. Cash sale as is condition, and at the bottom, the closing date December 12th, the day after the wedding. Day after wedding. They weren't going to wait a week, not even a day. The third image showed the signature lines. 3 spaces, 1 for me as seller, 1 for the buyer's agent, 1 for Graham Locke as listing agent and facilitator. All 3 spaces were blank, waiting for signatures that would transfer my house and everything in it for barely more than 1/3 of what it was worth. I sat in my car staring at those photographs while November wind rattled the windows and gray clouds rolled in from the ocean. The pieces assembled themselves with brutal clarity. Blackwell Properties, LLC. Not a name I recognized, but it didn't matter. Shell company, probably. Set up specifically for this transaction. Untraceable back to whoever was really buying, or more likely, whoever Sienna was working for. Someone who knew what was in my basement and wanted it badly enough to orchestrate a 3-year con to obtain it. $2.1 million for a property worth at least $4 million just for the land and house, for a collection appraised at $5.8 million that they didn't even know existed. Graham was getting paid to facilitate massive fraud, and he'd done it willingly, knowingly, with a pre-printed contract waiting in his desk drawer. The timeline was surgical. Wedding on December 11th, nursing home consent forms signed sometime before, medical assessment from Dr. Harlow declaring me incompetent. Then December 12th, while I was theoretically being moved into Meadowbrook, they'd finalized the sale using power of attorney Adrian had obtained through forged documents. By the time anyone questioned the legitimacy, the house would be sold, the contents dispersed, and Sienna would be gone with whatever she'd really come for. Except they'd made one critical miscalculation. They assumed I'd sign their documents because I didn't know they were fraud. They assumed I'd trust my son. They assumed I was exactly what they needed me to be, an elderly woman with valuable assets and no one to protect her. I opened my glove compartment and pulled out the folder Helen had given me 2 weeks ago. Inside were my documents, the real ones, the legal ones. Updated, will witnessed and notarized. Trust documents ironclad. Power of attorney that explicitly excluded property sales signed by all 3 trustees. Medical directive that required independent evaluation by 2 physicians neither party could have influenced. Every protection Helen and I had built over 12 years, all updated, all filed with the county clerk, all legally bulletproof. Adrian could sign whatever forged papers Sienna put in front of him. Dr. Harlow could produce whatever fraudulent assessments Marcus Brennan had paid her to create. Graham could wait at his desk with his pre-filled contract and his cut of the proceeds. None of it would matter, because none of it was legal. And in 6 days, at a wedding on a yacht with 350 witnesses, they'd discover that the woman they'd tried to steal from had spent 22 years preparing for exactly this moment. I texted Nina Perfectwork, "Come to the shop tonight. We need to coordinate with Russell." Then I texted Helen, "Have the counter documents ready. It's time." I sat in my car staring at those 3 photographs, my address, that insultingly low price, that ruthlessly calculated timeline. They'd prepared everything: contracts, medical assessments, buyer agreements, every document designed to strip me of everything Arthur and I had built. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing too, and my documents were actually legal. 6 days until the wedding. 6 days until I gave Adrian exactly what he thought he wanted: the chance to see his mother sign papers. Just not the papers he expected. They'd prepared fraudulent documents to steal my life. I'd prepared something better: the patience to let them think they'd won. 6 days before his wedding, Adrian showed up at my door with a manila folder and the rehearsed expression of someone about to ask for something they know they shouldn't. It was 8 in the evening, late enough that Sienna wouldn't question where he was. He stood on my porch with the folder tucked under his arm, his face carrying the exhaustion that comes from maintaining lies. "Mom," he said, "can I come in? I need you to sign some paperwork." I stepped aside and led him into the living room. He sat on the couch and opened the folder with careful movements, revealing maybe 15 pages with colored tabs, marking signature lines. "It's just insurance updates," Adrian said, not quite meeting my eyes. "My new employer requires updated health information for family members. Sign where the tabs are. Won't take a minute." He slid the papers across the coffee table. I picked them up and began to read. The first page had insurance company letterhead, Consolidated Health Partners, complete with logo and address. Below that, dense paragraphs of policy language about coverage updates and beneficiary changes. Standard insurance jargon designed to make eyes glaze over. But I'd spent 50 years reading contracts. I knew how to spot language that didn't belong. Page 3, buried in a paragraph about care coordination benefits, contained different terminology: consent for assisted living placement, medical necessity determination, facility transfer authorization. "This isn't insurance, Adrian," I said quietly. "This is nursing home admission paperwork." His face went through several expressions: surprise that I'd caught it, shame that he'd tried calculation about what to say next. "The insurance requires it," he said. "Just in case. It's standard for people over 65. You don't have to go anywhere. It's just bureaucratic paperwork so the coverage stays active. There's a particular kind of heartbreak in watching your child lie to your face, knowing exactly what they're doing and having to pretend you don't." I set the papers down and looked at my son. 42 years old, sitting in the house where we'd taught him right from wrong, watching him choose wrong anyway. "If I don't sign this, what happens to your insurance coverage?" I asked. Adrian's jaw tightened. "It gets complicated. Please, Mom, it's just a formality." I picked up the papers again and read page 7. Signature line for patient consent. Signature line for medical power of attorney. Signature line for facility placement approval. Everything Sienna needed to have me declared incompetent and removed from my home. Everything Adrian thought would solve his debt. Everything that would be completely legally worthless because these weren't real documents. Before I tell you what I signed that evening, are you still with me? Comment A if you think I should have refused outright, or B if you understand why I signed, and add your reason in one sentence. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes, but the emotional truth remains. I stood and walked to my desk, pulled out a pen, and returned to the coffee table. Adrian watched me with careful attention. I signed every page where the colored tabs indicated. My signature clear and steady on 15 pages of what Adrian believed were legal documents that would give him control over my life. "Thank you," he said, gathering the papers quickly. "This really helps, with everything." "I'm sure it does," I said. He stood to leave the folder tucked securely under his arm and paused at the door. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, might acknowledge what he'd just done. "I'll see you at the wedding," he said instead. 6 days. 6 days, I agreed. I watched through the window as he walked to his car and carefully placed the folder on the passenger seat like it contained something precious. His taillights disappeared down Ocean Avenue into the November dark. I waited 5 minutes, then picked up my phone and called Helen. She answered on the first ring. "Did he take them?" "Every page," I said. "He thinks I signed nursing home consent forms disguised as insurance updates. And he has no idea they're completely fabricated copies with no legal standing whatsoever." Helen said satisfaction in her voice. "The real documents are in my office, safe, unsigned, with 3 witnesses who can testify you never saw them. When you hand someone fake papers while they think they're stealing your life, you learn exactly what cold satisfaction feels like." "How long until he tries to use them?" I asked. "Day after the wedding, most likely," Helen said. "They'll need the nursing home consent to justify the power of attorney transfer. When they file the paperwork with the county clerk, it'll take maybe 4 hours before someone notices the documents don't match our records. And by then, we'll be on a yacht with 350 witnesses," I said. "By then, you'll be on a yacht with 350 witnesses," Helen confirmed. "And your son will be holding worthless paper, wondering why his fraud is falling apart in real time." I stood at my window looking out at the ocean at the dark water reflecting scattered lights from houses along the coast. Somewhere out there, Adrian was driving home to Sienna, telling her he'd secured the final signature that everything was in place. He had no idea I'd been building his cage for months. He had no idea every document he'd secured was fake. He had no idea the wedding yacht would become the stage for his own judgment. And he had absolutely no idea that the basement he planned to empty contained evidence that would destroy not just his scheme, but everyone who'd helped him build it. I watched Adrian's taillights disappear down Ocean Avenue, the manila folder on his passenger seat, containing documents that were worth exactly nothing. Helen answered my call on the first ring. "Did he take them?" "Every page," I said. My son would drive home thinking he'd trapped me. He had no idea I'd been building his cage for months. 6 days until the wedding. 6 days until my son discovered that the woman he'd tried to trap had been 3 moves ahead the entire time. Adrian drove away thinking he'd trapped me. But while he celebrated securing worthless papers, Sienna was making her own move, and this one required a different kind of counter. The man who walked into my shop at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon was too well dressed to be buying old curtains. Philip Garrett carried himself with the careful neutrality of someone hired to observe and report dressed just expensively enough to seem legitimate but not memorable. He had a folder under his arm and a practiced smile. "Good afternoon," he said, his eyes already moving past me to catalog the shop. "I'm working on a Victorian restoration project. I'm interested in period curtains, particularly 19th century pieces. Do you have anything that might work?" I was about to answer when I noticed Nina behind the counter. She'd gone completely still, watching this man with an intensity that made every hair on my neck stand up. "Let me check what we have," I said. "Nina, could you help me look in the back?" But Nina was already moving, not toward storage, toward the cutting table where I kept my button collection, 3,000 buttons, in a large wooden tray, the work of 40 years. She picked up the tray and dropped it. The crash was spectacular. 3,000 buttons hitting hardwood sounded like hail on tin, scattering everywhere, creating chaos that demanded immediate attention. "Oh no," Nina said, her voice loud enough to carry. "Mrs. Vale, I knocked over the entire button collection. I'm so sorry." I looked at her. She looked back with eyes that said everything. This man is not what he claims. Philip Garrett's careful expression cracked frustration. Calculation, someone whose reconnaissance had been interrupted. He glanced at his watch. "I should go," he said quickly. "I'll come back another time." He was gone before I could respond, his mission compromised by a 27-year-old assistant and a tray of buttons. When your assistant saves your life's work with a tray of buttons and perfect timing, you understand why loyalty matters more than skill. I locked the door and turned to Nina, who was already gathering buttons, even though we both knew that wasn't why she dropped them. "He wasn't looking at curtains," Nina said. "He was mapping the shop, Looking at the back door, the basement entrance, the security camera, his eyes went to every potential entry point. "Reconnaissance," I said, "which means she's planning something soon," Nina said. We both understood what needed to happen next. The real ivory dress couldn't stay in my basement anymore. That night at 11 o'clock, Nina and I descended to the basement one final time. The ivory dress hung where it had for decades, covered in black cloth, separated from the other dresses by 10 feet of space. I pulled away the cloth. 1952 ivory silk with hand-stitched lace at the wrists, Arthur's careful work visible in the reinforced lining where he'd hidden something worth dying for. "It's beautiful," Nina whispered. "Arthur really sewed evidence into this." "The night before he died," I said, running my fingers along the seam. "He spent until 3 in the morning making sure it would stay hidden." I carefully removed the dress and laid it in an archival garment box. In its place, I hung the replica I'd created 3 months ago, when I'd first understood what Sienna was planning. The copy was good. 95% identical to casual observation, with the same lace pattern, the same hand stitching. But the lining was empty. No microfilm, no evidence, no reason Arthur had died. We drove to Helen's office downtown, the garment box on the back seat. Helen met us in the parking garage, led us up the back elevator, and opened her office safe, the same safe where the real trust documents lived. The ivory dress went in beside them. "If they come for it now," Helen said, closing the safe, "all they'll find is a copy." "If they come for it now," I said, "they'll think they won." 2 figures, 3 a.m. basement door forced open. They took the replica. I watched the security footage the next morning in Helen's office. The timestamp read 3:17 a.m. 2 people in dark clothing entering through the basement window I'd left deliberately easy to access. They knew exactly where to go, moving through my basement like they'd studied a map. Because they had. Philip Garrett's reconnaissance delivered to Sienna turned into a break-in plan within 12 hours. They left at 3:35 a.m. carrying something wrapped in black cloth. My security camera caught them loading it into a dark sedan, careful and quick. Sienna had the dress she'd been hunting for 3 years. She'd orchestrated a relationship with my son, forged medical documents, hired lawyers and appraisers and break-in specialists, all to obtain the one piece of evidence that could prove Arthur had been murdered for discovering auction fraud. What she didn't know was that the microfilm Arthur died protecting was still safe in Helen's office, sealed in the lining of the real ivory dress, waiting for exactly the right moment to be revealed. And the dress she'd wear to her wedding, the dress she'd stolen in the dark, the dress she thought contained everything she'd worked for, was a copy I'd made specifically for this moment. I watched the security footage 3 times 2 people entering through the basement window at 3:17 a.m., leaving 18 minutes later, carrying something wrapped in black cloth. Sienna had the dress she'd been hunting for 3 years. What she didn't know was that the microfilm Arthur died protecting was still safe in Helen's office, and the dress she'd wear to her wedding was a copy I'd made specifically for this moment. I turned off the footage and looked at Helen. 5 days, I said. 5 days, Helen agreed, until she discovers what she's really wearing. 5 days until Adrian's wedding. 5 days until 350 guests watched Sienna walk down an aisle in a dress that proved nothing except how thoroughly she'd been played. 5 days until Russell projected evidence onto a yacht screen and every person who'd tried to steal from me discovered that the woman they'd underestimated had been building their reckoning for 22 years. Sienna thought she'd stolen victory in the dark at 3 a.m. She had no idea that the dress she'd wear to her wedding would be the instrument of her own exposure. I woke at 6 on the morning of my son's wedding to the sound of seagulls and the weight of Arthur's old sweater around my shoulders, the microfilm evidence he'd died protecting, tucked in the left pocket against my heart. The sweater was cream-colored wool, soft from 23 years of wearing a gift from Arthur for my last birthday before he died. I'd chosen it deliberately this morning because the left pocket was deep enough to hold the small metal cylinder smaller than my thumb, heavier than grief that contained proof of auction fraud and murder. The most valuable evidence in Newport hidden in the most ordinary place. My phone lit up on the nightstand. 6:15 a.m. Text messages arriving in careful coordination. Helen Trust is ready. Any transaction attempts today will trigger automatic freeze. All 3 trustees standing by. Russell screen installed. Video feed tested. Projection ready. We're in position. Celeste independent valuation complete. Documentation certified and ready to present. I texted back confirmation to both, then my phone rang. Nina. Mrs. Vale, she said, her voice tight with nerves. I'm shaking. I've been awake since 4. What if something goes wrong? What if... Keep shaking, I said calmly. But don't drop your phone. I'll need you to take photographs today. Photographs of what? Everything, I said. Every moment, every face, every reaction when the truth comes out. Silence on the line, then, you're really doing this. We're really doing this, I corrected, all of us, together. I hung up and stood before my bedroom mirror looking at what my family saw when they looked at me. A 69-year-old woman in an old sweater, gray hair pulled back in a sensible bun, no jewelry, no ceremony. The kind of woman who gets seated near the kitchen at weddings. The kind of woman whose signature on nursing home forms wouldn't be questioned because surely she's past the age of resistance. The kind of woman who's invisible. For months, I'd been building toward this single day, and now that it had arrived, I felt nothing but clear, cold certainty. I walked downstairs to make coffee, the microfilm a small weight in my pocket with every step. Through the kitchen window, I could see the ocean turning from gray to blue. As morning arrived, the same ocean Arthur had looked at every day. When he'd been alive, the same water that had witnessed 22 years of my preparation for this moment. My phone rang again at 9:30. Jonah. Grandma, he said, and his voice carried an intensity I'd never heard before. I sent Russell everything. The full dossier. Serena Nolan's connection to Blackwell Auction House, the newspaper archives from 1999, the photo comparisons proving Sienna and Serena are the same person, the timeline showing she planned this for 3 years. All of it. Thank you, I said. The employee list from Blackwell. Jonah continued, words coming faster now like he'd been holding them in. Serena Nolan was an appraiser there. She would have known about any fraud investigation. She would have known what Grandpa Arthur found. She would have known, I agreed quietly, and she came for you 22 years later, pretending to love Dad, pretending to want a family, all to get whatever evidence Grandpa Arthur hid. Jonah's voice cracked slightly. I'm doing this for him, Grandma, for Grandpa Arthur. I never met him. He died when I was just a baby too young to remember, but I want him to know someone in this family did the right thing. When a 28-year-old tells you he's fighting for a grandfather he never met, you understand that some debts transcend death. He knows Jonah. I said, my hand instinctively touching the pocket where Arthur's evidence rested. Somehow, across all these years, he knows, and he's proud of you. Will you be okay today? Jonah asked. At the wedding, seeing Dad go through with this. I looked out at the ocean at the December morning light turning the waves silver. I'll be exactly where I need to be. Where's that? Invisible, I said, until the moment I choose not to be. After Jonah hung up, I sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm, thinking about the architecture of this day. 350 guests would board a yacht at noon. Adrian would seat me near the kitchen, a physical manifestation of how little I mattered in his new life. Sienna would walk down an aisle wearing a dress she'd stolen in the dark, believing it contained the evidence that would make her untouchable. Russell would stand at the helm with a tablet connected to a projection screen, waiting for my signal. Helen would be positioned with her phone, ready to explain the trust structure to anyone who asked. Nina would take photographs that would become evidence. Jonah would watch his father marry a woman whose entire identity was a lie. And I would sit at a table near the kitchen staff wearing an old sweater, carrying evidence in my pocket being exactly what they expected, an elderly woman who'd been defeated, diminished, pushed aside, until I stood up, until I spoke, until I showed them what I'd been building for 22 years. I looked in the mirror one last time before leaving for the harbor. The old woman looking back wore an old sweater, gray hair and a sensible bun, no jewelry, no ceremony. exactly what they expected. What they didn't know was that I'd been invisible not because they refused to see me, but because I'd chosen not to be seen. Until today. Today I would let 350 people see exactly who Marjorie Vale was. They would see a woman who'd spent 22 years preparing for justice. They would see a wife who'd honored her husband's final gift. They would see a mother who'd loved her son enough to save him from his own worst choices. And they would see what happens when you underestimate a 69-year-old seamstress who knows how to read contracts, build alliances, and wait for exactly the right moment to reveal that every move you thought was yours had been choreographed by someone 3 steps ahead. I put on my coat and picked up my purse. The microfilm stayed in my sweater pocket close to my heart, exactly where Arthur had meant it to be. At noon, 350 guests would board a yacht, and invisibility would become my greatest weapon. At noon, I stepped into visibility by choosing exactly where they would not see me. Newport Harbor was crowded with elegantly dressed guests when I arrived, 350 people streaming toward the 3-story white yacht that Adrian had chartered for $60,000 he didn't have. December sun turned the water brilliant, and everyone wore sunglasses and smiles, nobody noticing the elderly woman in a cream cardigan walking alone toward the gangway. The yacht was called Serenity, which would have been funny if it weren't so perfectly wrong. I boarded with the main crowd, anonymous among couples and families, and Adrian's business associates, everyone flowing up the gangway in waves of silk and expensive cologne. At the top, a young woman in yacht staff uniform checked names against a tablet. "Marjorie Vale," I said. She smiled with professional warmth and gestured toward the main deck. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Vale. The ceremony begins at 12:30 on the upper deck reception immediately following." I walked onto a vessel that smelled like new carpet and catered food where white linen covered every surface and ice sculptures melted slowly in silver bowls. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the entire harbor boats. At anchor, the Newport coastline, the ocean stretching east toward nothing. Russell Ward stood at the helm on the captain's deck above, visible through the glass ceiling. He saw me and gave the smallest nod. "Everything is ready." Guests filled the main reception area, claiming tables marked with calligraphed name cards. I watched them sort themselves into the natural hierarchy of weddings family. At the front, important clients in the middle, casual acquaintances, and obligatory invitations toward the back. Adrian appeared beside me before I could find my assigned seat. "Mom," he said, and his voice carried that particular tone again, apologetic, as if my presence required management. "Your table is over here." He led me past the head table where Sienna would sit, past the family section where Jonah and his wife Clarissa had already claimed seats, Jonah's face tight with something between anger and dread, past the tables for Adrian's business partners, for Sienna's carefully curated friend group, for the people who mattered. We kept walking. Toward the back of the reception deck, near where catering staff moved in and out with trays, near where the kitchen sounds carried near, where the overflow seating merged with functional space. "Here," Adrian said, gesturing to a table marked with my name and 3 other guests I didn't recognize. "You'll be comfortable here. Good view of everything." I looked at the table, looked at its position, looked at my son's face as he waited for me to accept this final diminishment without protest. "Thank you, Adrian," I said. "This is perfect." Relief flickered across his expression. He'd been prepared for resistance, for hurt feelings, for the scene of a mother realizing she'd been seated like an afterthought. Instead, I smiled and set my purse on the chair, the microfilm in my sweater pocket heavier than any wedding gift. From this position, I could see everything. The entire reception deck, every table, every guest, the projection screen mounted above the captain's deck that supposedly would display wedding photos. Russell at the helm, his tablet ready. Adrian had seated me exactly where I needed to be. The ceremony was brief. 15 minutes of vows and promises and lies wrapped in silk and spoken over harbor water. Father Caleb Moore officiated with the tight smile of someone who'd been paid enough to ignore his conscience. I watched from my seat at the back while Adrian and Sienna faced each other under a floral arch, while they exchanged rings, while they kissed to applause from 350 witnesses. Then the reception began. Guests flowed back to their assigned seats. Servers appeared with champagne and appetizers. Music played from speakers hidden in the ceiling. Adrian and Sienna made their entrance as husband and wife, and the applause was genuine because nobody knew what they were really celebrating. I sat at my table near the kitchen and watched Sienna work the room. She moved with practiced grace, stopping at each important table, touching shoulders, laughing at jokes, performing the role of gracious bride with the skill of someone who'd studied for it. And she was wearing the dress. The ivory silk caught the December light streaming through the yacht's glass walls, and from this distance it looked perfect. The 1952 construction, the hand-stitched lace at the wrists, the careful draping that suggested wealth and taste and history. Nobody would know by looking that the lining was empty, that the dress had been created 3 months ago as a decoy, that the woman wearing it had stolen it from my basement, believing it contained evidence worth 3 years of her life. I touched my sweater pocket instinctively. The real microfilm rested there, smaller than my thumb, heavier than any dress. Celeste Rowan sat at a table near the center. I recognized her silver hair, her champagne silk suit, the careful attention with which she watched everything. She'd been a supermodel in the 80s, a philanthropist in the 90s, now a fashion historian whose expertise could validate or destroy reputations with a single observation. She was studying Sienna's dress with the intensity of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. The first course arrived at my table, salad untouched on my plate. Around me, 350 guests ate and drank and celebrated, nobody noticing the woman sitting near the kitchen staff, nobody wondering why the groom's mother had been seated like an afterthought. They thought I was invisible because that's what old women become. What they didn't understand was that invisibility was the greatest position I could have asked for. From this table, I could see everything, and when Russell activated that projection screen, when 350 faces turned toward the captain's deck, when the evidence I'd been protecting for 22 years appeared for everyone to see, they would finally understand that the woman they'd dismissed had been watching them the entire time. The bride walked past my table without looking down, the replica dress shimmering, her smile perfect, her hand clasped in my son's hand. She had the copy. I sat near the kitchen with the truth. The bride walked with a stolen copy while I held the truth in my pocket. But before I could choose when to reveal it, someone else chose to see me first. The woman in champagne silk stopped at my table, and her face went through 3 expressions. In 2 seconds, recognition, confusion, outrage. Celeste Rowan, 72, silver bob and champagne silk suit. She'd run Boston's premier textile auction house for 30 years before retiring to private collecting, and her eyes had the particular sharpness that came from decades of spotting frauds. Those eyes were currently moving from my face to my table placement to my face again. Marjorie Vale, she said, her voice carrying disbelief and anger. You're sitting here at the kitchen table. 4 other guests looked up with sudden interest. One was Marcus Brennan, Adrian's lawyer, the man who'd threatened Victor. His face went carefully neutral. Hello, Celeste, I said calmly. It's been a long time. Boston, 2004. Celeste said, pulling out the empty chair beside me. You restored that Edwardian walking suit for the Met's Costume Institute exhibit. I wrote about it. Called it the finest textile restoration work I'd seen in 20 years. Marcus Brennan's expression shifted. The other guests were listening now. That was kind of you, I said. Christie's valued the 1847 dress I bought from you at $340,000. Celeste said, her voice dropping but still audible. You're one of the most respected textile conservators on the East Coast, and they put you here. I watched recognition dawn in Marcus Brennan's eyes. The woman he'd helped frame as incompetent was being validated as an expert. Family weddings have complicated seating arrangements, I said. Celeste turned to look at the head table where Sienna sat in the ivory dress. That dress she's wearing, I've been studying it since the ceremony. It's supposed to be 1952, isn't it? Yes, I said. The stitching at the left wrist is wrong, Celeste said, taking on the analytical quality of an expert spotting a discrepancy. Inconsistent with period construction. The original would have internal reinforcement. That dress doesn't. My hand moved instinctively to my sweater pocket. The microfilm pressed against my palm. "Something is very wrong at this wedding," Celeste said, looking back at me. Before I could answer, the sound system crackled. 3 sharp taps echoed across the reception deck. Adrian stood at the microphone near the captain's bridge. His tuxedo perfectly pressed his face, arranged in sorrowful devotion. Sienna rose to stand beside him, dabbing at her eyes with a white handkerchief. 350 people, one lie, no way back. "Thank you all for celebrating with us today," Adrian began. "Before we continue, I need to share something personal, something difficult." He paused. The pause was calculated, designed to draw every eye. It worked. "My mother, Marjorie Vale," he said, and 350 faces turned toward my table, "has been struggling recently. Memory issues, confusion about daily tasks, difficulty managing her affairs." I sat frozen, my hands flat on the tablecloth, feeling the weight of all those eyes. "It breaks my heart," Adrian continued, his voice cracking slightly, "but I've made the difficult decision that my mother needs professional care. Meadowbrook Nursing Facility starting next week. It's the best choice for her safety." Sympathetic murmurs rippled across the deck. A woman nearby placed her hand over her heart. "My mother has voluntarily agreed to this transition," Adrian said, looking directly at me. "She signed the necessary paperwork. She understands this is what's best, and I'm grateful to my wife." He paused, smiling. "My wife, Sienna, for her unwavering support during this challenging time." Sienna stepped closer, the handkerchief pressed to her eyes, the stolen dress shimmering. The performance was flawless. At the family table, Jonah stood abruptly. His chair scraped against the deck. His wife, Clarissa, gripped his wrist, shaking her head once. Jonah's jaw clenched, but he sat back down, his hands curling into fists. The applause started slowly, one person, then another, then a wave of sympathetic support. 350 people clapping for a lie told so smoothly, it sounded like truth. I taste copper. I've bitten the inside of my cheek, but my hands are steady. Celeste turned to me, her voice low and urgent. "Is any of that true?" "No," I said quietly. "Not a word." "Then what?" Sienna appeared at my table before Celeste could finish. She crouched beside my chair, placed one hand on my forearm, her face arranged in concern that didn't reach her eyes. "Marjorie," she said, her voice pitched for nearby tables to hear, "I know this is hard, but you'll be so much happier at Meadowbrook, and we'll make sure everything is handled properly. The house sale closes Monday. Everything will be taken care of." Monday, 3 days from now, the timeline compressed like a fist. Sienna stood, smoothed her stolen dress, and walked back to Adrian. The reception resumed music conversations, the clink of glasses and murmur of 350 people who just witnessed what they believed was a son's difficult but necessary choice. Celeste stared at me. Marcus Brennan stared at me. The other guests at my table stared at me, waiting to see if the woman with memory issues would confirm or deny what they'd heard. I felt Russell before I saw him. He appeared at my left shoulder, his frame blocking the afternoon sun. He held a tablet, black sleek, and his thumb hovered over the screen. He aimed it toward the projection screen mounted above the captain's deck. Russell looked down at me. His expression was neutral, professional, but his eyes asked the only question that matters. "Mrs. Vale." He said, his voice pitched low enough that only I could hear. "May I proceed?" 350 people staring. Adrian just told them I signed voluntarily. I didn't sign anything real. The papers he took home were worthless, and I've never been calmer in my life. I looked up at Russell and gave him the smallest nod. "Show them everything." I gave Russell permission to show them everything. The smallest nod, barely visible, but it was enough. Russell Ward's voice cut through the applause before Adrian could sit down. "Excuse me," Russell said, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who'd spent decades making people stop and listen. "I have something everyone needs to see." The applause faltered, then died. 350 faces turned from Adrian to the man standing at the microphone near the captain's bridge. Russell descended from the helm, taking the steps with deliberate calm, a secondary microphone in his hand. He stopped in the center aisle where everyone could see him. "My name is Russell Ward," he said. I'm the captain of this vessel, but before I ran yacht services, I spent 23 years as an elder fraud investigator with the Boston Police Department. Adrian's face went from confusion to something like panic in the space of 3 seconds. "Mrs. Vale," Russell said, looking directly at me across 350 witnesses. "Would you like me to show these guests what I found?" I stood. For the first time that evening, I stood at my table near the kitchen, and every eye in the room watched me rise. I didn't speak. I just nodded once. Silent permission, public authorization, witness to what was about to be revealed. Russell touched the tablet in his hand, and the projection screen above the captain's deck, the screen that had displayed Adrian and Sienna's engagement photos during cocktail hour, flickered to life. "The first piece of evidence," Russell said, "is security camera footage from November 18th, 3 a.m. The screen showed my basement in night vision green. 2 figures entering through the window I'd deliberately left accessible. One of them moved with practiced efficiency to the far wall to the dress, covered in black cloth, removing it carefully and wrapping it back up. The camera angle caught a face for just 3 seconds as the figure turned. Clear, unmistakable. This is Sienna Moreau," Russell said, entering Marjorie Vale's home to steal a dress she believed contained evidence. She was wrong about which dress had the evidence, but the breaking and entering is documented. Gasps rippled through the reception deck. I watched Sienna's face go white, then red, her hand clutching Adrian's arm. "The second piece of evidence," Russell continued, "is video footage provided by Jonah Vale." The screen changed. Adrian in his office talking to his phone camera, not realizing it was recording. His voice carried across the yacht's sound system. "Graham, I need you to move fast on this. Sell it immediately after we get control. Keep the appraisal low, no one needs to know what it's really worth. My mother won't be in a position to object." I watched my son's face on the screen. Watched my son's face at the head table go white. 4 pieces of evidence, 4 lies, 400 eyes watching them crumble. The third piece of evidence, Russell said, and the screen changed to a document, is a purchase contract from Graham Holt. The name appeared highlighted on screen, offering $2.1 million for a property appraised at $5.8 million. The closing date is December 12th, tomorrow, 1 day after this wedding. Murmurs turned to shocked conversation. People were pulling out their phones, taking pictures of the screen, documenting what they were seeing. "The fourth piece of evidence," Russell said, his voice cutting through the noise, "is a cognitive impairment assessment signed by Dr. Elise Harlow, declaring Marjorie Vale incompetent. Mrs. Vale never visited Dr. Harlow. She never signed consent for evaluation. This document is a forgery." The screen showed the medical letterhead, the forged signature, the recommendations for immediate institutional placement. "And finally," Russell said, touching his tablet one more time, "we have Helen Ashford, Mrs. Vale's attorney." The screen changed to a video call. Helen appeared sitting in her office, looking directly at the camera with the calm authority of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Good afternoon," Helen said, her voice carrying clearly. "I'm Helen Ashford, trust attorney for the Vale Textile Heritage Trust. As of 2 hours ago, all asset transfers related to Marjorie Vale's property have been frozen pending an elder abuse investigation. Any documents claiming power of attorney or medical incompetence are void. The trust requires 3 trustees' signatures for any transaction, and I can confirm that no legitimate paperwork has been signed." I watched my son's face go white. This is not triumph. This is grief with witnesses. The screen went dark. The yacht was silent except for the sound of water against hull, the low hum of engines, 350 people trying to process what they'd just seen. Adrian sat frozen at the head table, his tuxedo perfect, his face the color of chalk. Around him, wedding guests were staring, whispering, some standing to get better views of the screen, others pulling out phones to photograph or record. Sienna stood abruptly. Her chair fell backward, clattering against the deck. She pointed at the screen at Russell, at me, her voice rising to something shrill and uncontrolled. "That's not, you can't, this is a lie." She turned to the crowd, her composure completely shattered. "She's manipulating all of you. That footage is fake. The documents are fake. This entire thing is..." The footage is time-stamped and authenticated, Russell said calmly. The documents are certified copies, and the trust freeze is already in effect with the county clerk's office. Everything you just saw is evidence in an active investigation. Sienna's face went through a dozen expressions: rage, panic, calculation, desperation. The woman who'd spent 3 years performing grace and sympathy and false concern was finally publicly, catastrophically exposed. She looked at Adrian. Tell them this is wrong, tell them. But Adrian wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me. Across 350 witnesses, across the wreckage of his wedding and his scheme and his carefully constructed lies, my son looked at his mother and understood exactly what had just happened. I'd been 3 moves ahead the entire time. 350 people silent. Adrian frozen at the head table. Sienna, for the first time since I met her, had lost her composure, entirely pointing at the screen, her voice shrill, her words incoherent. The room was waiting to see what I would do next. The room waits for me to speak. I reach into my sweater pocket and pull out the microfilm case, the one Sienna thinks she stole. I hold it up so the light catches the brass clasp. 350 people lean forward. Adrian half rises from his chair. Sienna's face drains of color. Before I reveal what's inside, I say, I'd like to hear from some of our distinguished guests. Bianca Sloan stands, the wedding planner who charged Adrian $40,000 for today. She smooths her cream suit jacket and speaks in her clipped professional tone. Mrs. Vale, I want to state for the record that Sloan Events is formally withdrawing all services from this wedding effective immediately. Adrian lunges toward her. You can't, we have a contract, which includes a fraud liability clause, Bianca says. Her voice could cut glass. Given the evidence presented here today, I cannot in good conscience lend my company's reputation to this event. You'll receive a full refund minus expenses already incurred. She gathers her portfolio and walks out. Her assistant follows. Father Caleb Moore rises next. The elderly priest looks pained, but his voice is steady. Adrian, Sienna, I want to speak privately with both of you before I file the marriage certificate with the county clerk. There are questions I cannot, in good conscience, leave unanswered. Sienna finds her voice. We've done everything required. The ceremony is complete, Father Caleb says carefully, but the civil filing has not yet been submitted. Until it is, I have an obligation to pause. He looks at the evidence still displayed on the screen above us. A marriage built on deception is not one I can help make permanent before God. He sets down his pen and steps back from the table, where the marriage certificate waited unsigned. The room ripples with whispers. Some guests are already standing, collecting their things. Adrian's face has gone from white to purple. This is insane, he shouts. Mother, you've destroyed everything. No, darling, my voice is gentle. I've saved everything. Celeste Rowan steps forward. She's holding a leather portfolio and her expression is all business. Mrs. Vale, may I nod. Celeste opens the portfolio and removes a document. I've completed my independent valuation of your collection. 847 dresses cataloged and authenticated over the past 6 weeks. My conservative estimate, she pauses for effect, $5.8 million. The room erupts. Guests gasp, whisper point. Graham Locke has gone gray. Celeste continues, her voice rising above the noise. Furthermore, I found no evidence of cognitive decline in Mrs. Vale's record keeping. Her documentation is meticulous, professional, and entirely sound. Any suggestion otherwise is, in my professional opinion, fraudulent. She hands me the portfolio. I take it with trembling hands. Thank you, Celeste. It's been an honor, she says and squeezes my shoulder before returning to her seat. Victor Lane approaches from the back of the room. The elderly man, Arthur's oldest friend, moves slowly, leaning on his cane. In his other hand, he carries a cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. Marjorie, he says. His voice cracks slightly. I have something Arthur asked me to give you. My breath catches. Arthur. He left this with me 22 years ago. Specific instructions to be delivered only if someone tried to take your collection through legal means. My hands shake as I take the envelope. The wax seal bears Arthur's signet ring, the one I buried him with. How? I break the seal. Inside Arthur's handwriting, still clear after 2 decades. My dearest Marjorie, if you're reading this, someone has tried to take what you've built. I'm sorry I'm not there to stand beside you, but I can still help. Remember what I taught you about hiding valuables. Never keep the most important thing where they're looking. Let them find something, just not the real thing. The microfilm in the ivory dress was always a decoy, real photographs, but copies I made the same night. The originals are sewn into the lining of your gray cardigan, the one you wear every day, the one no thief would ever think to steal. Trust yourself. Trust what I taught you, and when the moment comes, show them that a woman who can restore history can also preserve it. All my love always, Arthur. I look up. Sienna is staring at me at the microfilm case in my hand at the letter. I watch realization dawn in her eyes. The dress, she whispers. I wore it all day. You wore the replica, I say. I reach into my sweater pocket again, the deep one on the right side, and pull out a second microfilm case. This one is older. The brass tarnished the clasp stiff. This is the real one. The original documentation Arthur gathered from the Providence auction photographs of falsified provenance records, forged appraisal certificates, names of buyers and sellers in a fraud scheme worth millions. The evidence that someone killed him to suppress. I hold up the case from the dress. That one contains duplicate photographs Arthur made deliberately, as decoys, real images, but not the originals. Enough to look convincing, not enough to prosecute anyone. Sienna sways. Adrian catches her arm. You let me steal it, she says. You let me wear it all day. I let you think you'd won, I correct. There's a difference. I look at Adrian, my son, my only child. The boy I raised, the man I no longer recognize. Your father knew this might happen. He knew that someday someone might try to take everything we built. So he taught me how to protect it, how to hide what matters most in plain sight. I slip both microfilm cases back into my pockets, pat them gently. The question now, what I say, is what happens next. Sienna's composure has finally truly shattered. Her hands are shaking. Her eyes dart to the exits, to Adrian, to Russell Ward, standing with his arms crossed near the door. Adrian, she says. Her voice is small now, frightened. Adrian, we need to leave, now. But Adrian can't move. He's staring at me like he's seeing me for the first time. Or perhaps for the first time in years, he's actually looking. The yacht's engines cut to idle as we approach Newport Harbor, and I see 2 people in dark suits waiting at the pier. Sienna tried to flee 10 minutes ago, grabbing Adrian's arm and pulling him toward the terrace exit. But Russell Ward blocked the way with the captain beside him. The yacht was heading to port. No one was leaving early. Now we glide toward the dock. Sienna grips the railing knuckles white. Adrian stands 3 feet away, not touching her. The distance has grown with every passing minute. The yacht bumps against the dock. The crew secures the lines. One of the dark-suited figures steps forward, a woman in her 40s with a badge at her belt. Ms. Sienna Moreau. Her voice carries across the deck. Sienna's head snaps up. Yes. I'm Special Agent Karen Reyes, Rhode Island State Police. We need you to come with us regarding allegations of elder fraud and theft. The words hang in the salt air. 350 wedding guests watch from the upper deck, the salon windows the stern. No one makes a sound. Sienna looks at Adrian. Tell them this is insane. Adrian stares at her. His face is blank. Adrian, her voice cracks. Adrian, please. He steps back. I watch him realize it. The $680,000 debt that appeared 6 months after they met. The rushed wedding. The nursing home brochures in his car. The appraiser who was a friend of a friend. Every piece perfectly placed. Every move choreographed. He wasn't the architect. He was the door she needed opened. You used me, he says quietly. The whole time. You used me. Sienna's composure shatters. I loved you. No. His voice is flat. You loved what I could give you access to. Agent Reyes steps onto the yacht with her partner. Sienna backs toward the railing. Ms. Moreau, please come with us voluntarily. We can do this quietly. Sienna looks at me one last time. Pure hatred, but underneath bone-deep fear. They lead her down the gangway in her ivory wedding dress. The dress she stole. The dress that held nothing but garden photographs and her own certainty. Graham Locke appears at the crowd's edge, the private collector who offered $2.1 million for a collection worth nearly 6 million 62-years-old, silver-haired expensive suit, suddenly looking like a costume. He sees Adrian and changes direction, immediately hurrying down the opposite gangway without a word. Graham, Adrian calls. We still have a deal. But Graham is gone, disappearing into the parking lot. The $2.1 million offer evaporating. Dr. Elise Harlow stands near the bow phone pressed to his ear. I catch fragments: legal representation, board review, or falsified assessment. His hand shakes. The doctor, who declared me incompetent, is calling his lawyer from the scene of his exposure. Russell Ward approaches. Mrs. Vale, the car is waiting whenever you're ready. I nod, but I don't move. I'm watching Adrian. My son stands alone on the pier at his own wedding. Guests file past without speaking. Some avoid his eyes. Others stare. The captain announces shuttle boats will return everyone to shore. No reception will happen. I watch my son stand alone on a pier at his own wedding. This is not victory. This is the grief of what could have been. He looks up. Our eyes meet across 30 feet of deck. For a moment, I think he might speak. Apologize, explain, ask forgiveness. But he turns away. Walks down the gangway with hunched shoulders, hands in pockets. 56 years old and looking ancient. I close my eyes, breathe the salt air, feel the microfilm case in my sweater pocket. Mrs. Vale. I open my eyes. Nina Price stands beside me, my assistant of 3 years, the young woman who had stood with me through every step of this with kind eyes and steady hands. She's smiling gently. Jonah is waiting on the pier. Let me help you down. She offers her arm. I take it. My legs are steadier than this morning, but I'm grateful. We walk down the gangway together. The pier is crowded with departing guests, investigators taking statements, crew securing the yacht. But I see only one person, Jonah. My younger son stands at the pier's edge, 28 years old, wearing jeans and a gray sweater. He's been here the whole time, Russell told me, coordinating with investigators, gathering evidence, building the case that saved everything. He doesn't speak when I reach him, just pulls me into his arms. I breathe in his cologne, the same brand Arthur wore. Feel his heartbeat, strong, steady, safe. I've got you, Grandma, he whispers. It's over. 847 dresses, one truth, and Arthur knew exactly which one would save us. I pull back to see Jonah's face. He has Arthur's eyes, Arthur's steadiness, Arthur's understanding that some things are worth protecting at any cost. Your father would be proud of you, I say. Jonah's eyes fill. He'd be proud of you. You did this, Grandma. You protected everything. I reach into my sweater pocket. Pull out the microfilm case, the real one with Arthur's preservation work documented in careful detail. The evidence that was never where they were looking. Your father taught me something, I say. I'm speaking to Jonah, but talking to Arthur. To the man who loved me 41 years. To the conservator who understood that preservation isn't about hiding things away. It's about keeping them close enough to defend. I look back at the yacht. The ivory Verdier dress is in an evidence bag now. The dress that started everything. The dress that ended everything. The ivory dress was always Arthur's love letter across time. The microfilm was protection, but the real gift was teaching me to never be afraid of what I knew. Arthur, you taught me, I whisper, and you protected us both from the other side of death. Nina takes my other hand. Jonah keeps his arm around my shoulders. Russell Ward joins us, nodding once a job completed, a trust honored. The sun sets over Newport Harbor. The water turns gold, then amber, then deep blue. The yacht rocks gently. Somewhere behind us, Adrian is alone. Sienna is being questioned. Graham has fled. Dr. Harlow faces consequences. But here on this pier, I am surrounded by people who chose to protect rather than take, who understood that 847 dresses represent more than money. They represent history, craftsmanship, love across generations. The microfilm stays in my pocket, close to my heart. where the most important things have always belonged. And to you listening to my story, remember this: the people closest to you aren't always the ones protecting you. Looking back, I wish I had seen the signs earlier. I made the mistake of believing that love alone would keep my family honest. I ignored the small betrayals, the questions about my finances, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Don't make my mistake. Trust isn't just given because someone shares your blood. It's earned through actions, not words. What I learned through this grandma revenge story is that protecting what you've built isn't selfish, it's necessary. Raw revenge in its purest form isn't born from hatred, it's defending what matters. Arthur taught me that preparation is love across time. I believe God put me through this to show that every grandma revenge born from justice carries its own dignity. Kindness doesn't mean defenselessness. Sometimes raw revenge simply means refusing to be a victim. That raw revenge, when rooted in truth, coexists with grace. Real grandma revenge isn't cruelty, it's courage. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have done things differently? If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about standing up for what's right, please subscribe to Her Family Revenge. Your support means everything to me. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time is precious, and I'm honored you spent it with me. One final note: while some details have been adjusted for storytelling purposes, the lessons and emotions at the heart of this story are entirely real. God bless you.